to the December 10th, 2015 meeting of the Galt House of the Downtown Rotary Club. My name is Greg Braun. I'm your president. We have a lot of fun and a great meeting in store today. So let's begin with our invocation from John Anderson.
Dear God, we are thankful.
And I'm a huge fan of Frank. In fact, I know most of you know about Frank Sinatra, but I had three stories, three little tidbits to tell you may or may not know. And then we'll have Doug sing. The first is buried. Frank Sinatra's buried with a roll of dimes in his pocket. True story, because when his son was kidnapped, he had to run around. There was no cell phones back then. He was running around all the town dealing with kidnappers, borrowing dimes. So he said he never would do that again. And as a result, carried a roll of dimes in his pocket and is actually buried with that. Two, the first karate movie fight scene in cinema history was a Frank Sinatra movie. True story. 1962, Manchurian Candidate. He was actually in a karate scene. First scene of the take of the movie, he actually injured his hand, so much so that for the next 35 years, it bothered him a lot. He had trouble with his hand. And as a result, he had to turn down two iconic movie roles because he felt that he couldn't handle a gun. The first went to Clint Eastwood. He turned down Dirty Harry. And the second movie he turned down went to Bruce Willis, Die Hard. True story. Finally, late 1960s, early 70s, Hanna-Barbera, the cartoon people, were trying to make a new cartoon for kids. You all probably know what this cartoon is after I tell you. But it was about 5 kids who they would be running around in a van. They would solve mysteries. And the lead character was a 6-foot talking dog. And they're like, what are we going to name this? They almost shelved the cartoon because they couldn't figure out what to name the dog in this cartoon show until a producer heard at the end of a Frank Sinatra song, Frank saying, Scooby-Dooby-Doo. And from that came Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? The cartoon was a hit, and the rest is history. So some little tidbits about Frank. Doug is a Louisville native, works at Chitlin Medley, is a business development officer, has been singing Frank Sinatra songs. Actually, he has an album, CD, and all the proceeds from this will go to the Rotary Club and to Junior Achievement today if you purchase it. So to do a little honor to Frank, old Blue Eyes, Doug Helm, accompanied by Charlie Kastner. Round of applause, please.
That helps. Frank Sinatra always introduced a little bit about his song and gave credit to the people that he worked with. I'll give my credit to Charlie Kastner. He's the power of this group up here. The song I'm going to sing was written in 1946 by Joseph Myron. Sinatra, as is usual, picked it up later in his life, and it became a signature song for him and more famous than it was originally. He originally sang it in the movie Songs for Swingin' Lovers. So here you go. You make me feel so young. You make me feel like spring is sprung. And every time I see you grin, I am such a happy individual the moment that you speak. I want to go play hide and seek. I want to go and bounce the moon just like a toy balloon, because you and I are just like a couple of tots running across the meadow, picking up lots of forget-me-nots. You make me feel so young. You make me feel like we're songs to be sung, lots of bells to be rung, and a wonderful fling to be flung. And even when I'm old and gray, I'm gonna feel the way I do today, because you make me feel so young. You make me feel so young. You make me feel like spring has sprung. And every time I see you grin, I'm such a happy individual the moment that you speak. I'm gonna go play hide and seek. I want to go and bounce the moon just like a toy balloon, because you and I are just like a couple of tots. We are strolling across the meadow, picking up lots of forget-me-nots. You make me feel so young. You make me feel there are songs to be sung, lots of bells to be rung, and a wonderful spring to be sprung. And even when I'm old and gray, I'm gonna feel the way I do today, because you make me feel so. You make me feel so. You make me feel so young.
Doug Helm, thank you so much.
Jim and I met during Bingham Fellows earlier this year, and we grew up in the same part of Kentucky. I'm from Nelson County, and he's from Marion County, and like many of us, the foundation of Cornbread Mafia really is, the book that Jim wrote, really is kind of the intertwined throughout the book, and it means something to people who came from that part of the Commonwealth. An Ivy League educated journalist, Jim has written for Politico magazine, Esquire, Fortune, Al Jazeera, America, and most recently the Washington Post with the Kim Davis, I don't know which one to call it, in Central Stuff. Yeah, Stuff. I'm glad to welcome my good friend Jim Hickman to the stage.
Lucas for inviting me. And Lucas, like he said, we met in Bingham Fellows this past year. We were working on improving relations between Louisville and the rest of the state and in Frankfurt. And so that was a very big lift, both for Bingham Fellows and for those of us who were deputized to be a part of it. I see Matt Ayers back here and Mr. Lanham over here, Todd Lanham, also part of our class. So we put in a lot of time this past year on Bingham Fellows, and this is just sort of one of the fruits of that, being able to be invited to a group like you to talk to this, about this subject today. So, thanks again, Lucas. So I started working on this Cornbread Mafia book in 2006, back when marijuana was a dirty word, and it took me 6 years to write, which was about 4 years longer than I expected it to take. I lost my publisher at one point, and then the economy collapsed in 2008, the publishing industry shrank, and then Amazon took over. So it was very difficult for a first-time writer to get a book contract, and I managed to sort of bootstrap myself into a new contract in 2010 and put myself on a deadline for the book coming out right before Derby in 2012. And I've been on this constant book tour ever since. Book tours are supposed to last 2 or 3 months, and I'm 3 years out and still getting calls. The irony is not, lost on me, nor people, in New York. I talked to my editor and my publisher in Connecticut yesterday, and he said, yeah, we still see your sales. Like, apparently my sales are still where, newer books are at. So, that's due to folks like you and spreading the word and having written a book that really sort of tapped into an audience that existed here locally. I mean, when people in New York buy books as a business, they're never counting on the Kentucky book buying market to sell a book. They're the smartest people they know, and they can't find Kentucky on a map, and they don't want to. And so the fact that I could sell out of my first printing really before my release date, because there were 10,000 people in Kentucky who wanted that book as quickly as they could get it, really speaks to the importance of this topic that I've written about, that up until very recently has been taboo to discuss in settings such as this. What does marijuana have to do with the tax-paying, church-going business community? And to have an opportunity to begin that conversation or to continue that conversation is very important to me. It's why I sort of got into this racket of telling stories of people who were caught up in the criminal justice system for being entrepreneurs and taking risks, and ended up doing 10, 15, 20, 35 years in prison, life in prison without parole, because they were willing to take a risk to create a product that had a market that needed to be filled. And so as I sort of talk about the business aspects of the book that I wrote, I'll be mindful of these 4 tenets. I'll be sure to make sure that I speak the truth and that it's fair to all concerned. It's really interesting in the current climate. We now have a governor, as of yesterday, that is publicly in favor of medical marijuana. This is a new thing. Our previous governor certainly wouldn't touch it, and the Democratic candidate was vocally against it, was vocally against industrial hemp when we worked to get that passed in 2013. And so now we have a Republican governor who's in favor of medical marijuana, and I'm sort of skew a little young for this crowd, but I'm not so young that I don't remember when marijuana law reform was a Democratic Party issue, and the Democratic Party in this state seems to have lost sight of that. And so hopefully with the governor being on record as being in favor of medical marijuana, that good Democrats can help him move that along. It was introduced in the House last year, passed out of committee, and then was quickly scuttled by House leadership because they were afraid of it. And people were afraid of marijuana legislation because they're constantly afraid that the other side will use it against them. And they're probably right. Except for these days, the other side is more likely than not, to be in favor of similar reforms because they see the cost of prisons escalating and the amount of the justice budget that the prisons eat up. And they see other states moving forward with medical marijuana and full legalization, and rightly worry that we're getting left behind. We're getting left behind economically. We're also getting left behind. We're not retaining our veterans who want marijuana for their PTSD or moving to other states where it's available to them safely. We're losing growers in this industry. California and Oregon and Colorado are filled with Kentuckians who know how to grow cannabis and have gone there to do it because they're not getting harassed by the police and they're able to make money and pay taxes and do what they do well. So there's hundreds, maybe thousands of Kentuckians that we've lost because of our drug laws and how Western states, particularly Western states, but increasingly Eastern states as well, have begun to change their laws as it relates to marijuana and creating environments that are more friendly to business as it relates to the cannabis industry. So just recently I was in Los Angeles, and it's remarkable to see. I mean, in Los Angeles, it's still not legal like it is in Denver or Seattle or Portland, Oregon, but it's legal enough. And in this time next year, California will vote on a full legalization bill similar to what Colorado has already voted on. And once California legalizes adult use marijuana, that's pretty much it. California is the 8th largest economy in the world, and it dictates a lot of American policy by virtue of just the size of its economy. And the further we lag behind as a state on this policy issue, the further we're going to lag behind in economic development. And so As you think about what to ask me here in the question and answer portion, keep in mind these sorts of things, like how our criminal justice policy as it relates to marijuana is affecting our economy negatively, and how other states are taking advantage of that. Now, the one bright spot that we do have in Kentucky is that we've managed to legalize industrial hemp as of last year, 2 years ago, with the help of, spearheaded by Jamie Comer as Agricultural Commissioner, and through the House, through the Senate, and then the Attorney General at the time said, well, it's still illegal under federal law, so Mitch McConnell changed the Farm Bill to include a provision that legalized industrial hemp in university studies and in state's Department of Agriculture. So in Kentucky, we have implemented a scheme. We're one of 4 states with industrial hemp, and this year was our second harvest. And the first year's harvest was just it was just a success to get it in the ground and out of the ground without it being interdicted by federal authorities. And in this second year harvest, now we're facing the real challenges of implementing a new industrial crop into the agricultural economy, which is the entire manufacturing processes by which we take that crop and monetize it have been lost over the 40 years or 80 years that it's been illegal, however you want to calculate it. We've lost technology to Asia and to Australia and to Canada and to Europe. We no longer have things like decorticators, which are the things that would separate the fiber of the hemp plant off of the stalk in order to use that to turn it into fabric, which you run it into through a thing called a cottonizer, which we no longer have, and then through a loom that's designed for hard textiles like hemp and flax and linen, which we also don't have. NAFTA got rid of those some time ago. So now we've got a lot of farmers who are interested in planting hemp, but without certainty that there is a market for the hemp that they want to grow. So hemp has 3 major components in its finished form. There's the seed, which is the easiest part of this plant to get to market. Caudill Seed locally is a 100-year-old family-owned agribusiness that is very interested in helping move that hemp seed to market. And so of all the projects that are going forward, it's my understanding that seed-based business models are doing the best, but you also have the stalk, or the fiber, and then the hurd, the H-U-R-D, which is the cellulosic content between the fibers and the stalk. And that hurd is very rich in cellulose, so something like 75–76% cellulose in that hurd, which makes it very good for things like plastics and for cellulosic ethanol. There are all these studies during the Bush administration. Remember George W. Bush talked about switchgrass? Switchgrass for ethanol has about 36% cellulose. The hemp hurd has 2 or 3 times that, double that in cellulosic content. So the studies for cellulosic ethanol with the hemp-based cellulose is very promising, although it's not quite there yet, so we're not filling our tanks with hemp ethanol just yet, but the research is promising. But we still have this very large gap between the hemp industry in its second year and where it needs to be in order to provide Kentucky agriculture with a sustainable, profitable crop to replace tobacco that we still haven't quite replaced. So that's the current state of things as far as cannabis law goes in Kentucky. And it's an interesting time to be aware of it. The other component of this to be mindful of is just this morning, Governor Bevin apparently has appointed Representative John Tilley, a Democrat from Hopkinsville, as his Justice Secretary. So that seems to be a very big deal. John Tilley was the author of much of the criminal justice reform that's come out of the Kentucky legislature in recent years, including implementing the needle exchange and other harm reduction aspects to the heroin bill that passed last year. So John Tilley is a very forward-thinking Democrat on these issues, and that Bevin would appoint him Justice Secretary is a very promising sign that Bevin is serious about doing criminal justice reform in this state. So, let's watch and see how that plays out, because that's fascinating from my point of view as someone who's been watching criminal justice reform change really since the minute I started working on this book. there's this small anecdote that I narrate in the last chapter of the book where I'm hanging out with Johnny Boone, who's this character on the cover of my book, who's currently a federal fugitive. I was hanging out with him before he became a federal fugitive. Are there any federal agents in the house? Laugh. Because they introduce themselves afterwards. They're like, "Hi, I'm with the DEA." So I was hanging out with Johnny Boone, and it was February of 2008. He had stopped over where I was staying. And I remember because it was during the 2008 presidential election, and oh, sorry, my phone was ringing. It was during the 2008 presidential election. Johnny stopped by. It was just as Senator Obama had won the Potomac primaries, the Maryland, Virginia, D.C. primary. He was giving a speech in Madison, Wisconsin. That was a big sort of, to-do barn burner, candidate Obama style. And Johnny Boone turns to me and says, "Do you ever think that a guy like that would legalize marijuana?" I was like, "Johnny, I don't know." And here we are, 1 year left to go in Obama's presidency, and while he has made some baby steps in that direction, his administration could have done a lot more, should do a lot more. We have had in Lebanon, in Marion County, 2 recipients of presidential pardons and 1 commutation of a prison sentence from the president, of which our community is very grateful. Les Berry, who's a character in my book, he's the guy who drove the getaway car out of that Minnesota deal where Johnny Boone and a bunch of his men got arrested. Les Berry had been out of prison for quite some time. He received a pardon of his previous crime. So he was merely, he was working a job at a cooperage in Lebanon, having lived in the same house in Loretto and married to the same woman since he went into prison. And he was a U.S. Marine Corps veteran, which certainly helped his petition. But the important one is Daryl Hayden. Daryl Hayden was serving life in prison without parole. He's from Loretto. All 3 strikes, so he got caught with, he got busted on the 3 strikes and you're out law that Bill Clinton signed in '96. His strikes were in 1980, 1990, and 2002. His 2002 strike, he got caught in Michigan on a farm with 19,000 marijuana plants. So when you're talking about marijuana growers, this guy was growing a serious amount of marijuana. It's a lot. When I talk to these legal growers out in California and I say, yeah, 19,000 plants, the legal growers are like, wow, that's a lot. So it's a lot. And so he was doing life without parole. And the president commuted his sentence in March, and now Daryl Hayden is home. He's on Facebook. He has like 500 friends on Facebook. So if you're on Facebook, get on there, find Daryl Hayden, say hello. No, really, like it's really a big deal. He's home now. And what's important about that is he's one of thousands of people who are caught up in this criminal justice system that has sentenced people to prison for far longer than their crimes would have seemed to have warranted. So Daryl Hayden being home in our community is great as an anecdote, but as it relates to the systematic change necessary to ensure that people don't get caught up in the same sort of dragnet that he did and have his life ruined because other people don't care for what he's growing in his farm in Michigan, no matter how many thousands of plants it is important to keep in mind that there's a lot of people, particularly people of color, who are caught up in this system that don't deserve to be in there. And Daryl Hayden happens to be a very clear-cut example of someone who has received the president's commutation powers, and that's fantastic. But it's in terms of the damage done by the drug war and by our mandatory minimum sentencing policies, has during presidential administrations of both parties over the last 40 years. There's a lot of damage to be undone. There's a lot of damage to our economy. There's a lot of these people that we're sending away to prison for this long are the risk takers and the entrepreneurs who have a lot of value to add to the economy if they were allowed to work instead of running from the law. Like Johnny Boone's been on the run from the law since 2008. He's facing 3 strikes and you're out. So instead of surrendering himself in effect to a death sentence, he played catch me if he can and went off running, and they never caught him, haven't caught him. Which is why I asked if there's federal agents in the room, because anytime I speak and it's publicized, especially in Louisville, they might send a guy. So that's always fun. The book events, they come up and they're like, wait in line. So that's really all I have to talk about. And this is, I've been, and I guess the other thing is I just finished writing this piece. It's on Thrillist right now. I just tagged it. I'm just putting it on my Facebook and my Twitter feeds. So if you're on Facebook, I'm at Jim Higdon, or facebook.com/Jim Higdon. I'm very easy to find. I just went around and interviewed 7 people who have made the transition from illegal marijuana work into legal marijuana work in states where that's legal. And so finding 7 people willing to discuss their criminal pasts and their current legal tax-paying work as members of the legal cannabis industry, whether that's in Colorado or California or Arizona or Washington, D.C., was really difficult. It's really difficult to get people out in the open to discuss something that's still very delicate and in most circles still taboo. So it took me several weeks of finding people who might fit that profile of people who have transitioned from illegal to legal work, and then even people who do fit that profile, getting them in to talk to me without them being anonymous was quite a chore. And in the end, I got 7 people, 5 men and a woman, or 6 men and a woman, I can't count. And most of them have relocated to Colorado, but they're from all over. And one of these guys that I talked to is a guy named Steve Tuck, who is one of the most important medical marijuana aficionado horticulturalists in California. He was a pioneer of the California medical marijuana scene in the 90s. Folks might have heard of Humboldt County up in Northern California. It's like the Marion County of California. Steve Tuck was one of these wounded, disabled veterans who moved to Humboldt County to start one of the first medical marijuana clinics in California, and consequently had all this trouble with the federal government, as one might imagine, but has now landed safely back in Southern California, and he's working as a resident horticulturalist for one of these legal marijuana startup companies and doing quite well. And he's one of many of the Kentuckians who is a professional in this industry that we have run out of the state. And because of our continued ambivalence towards addressing this issue, he and a number of people, like him, won't come back home because people like him. He's got wounded from a parachuting accident in the military. He's got 13 vertebrae are bolted together or something along his back. His lumbar vertebrae is all bolted together. He medicates with marijuana every day. And so to come to Kentucky risks him exposing himself to arrest and prosecution for what he considers, his daily medicine. So people like him don't come back. And it's really unfortunate as we're, as a nation, going through this transition process. We need to be mindful as Kentuckians that if we don't get out on front of this, we're going to get left behind. And would really be a shame with Kentucky, with its legacy of cultivation of this particular plant. I'm just reading the Harlow Giles Unger biography of Henry Clay, and Henry Clay grew hemp on his plantation at Ashland in Lexington. That was Henry Clay's primary crop. And now we are, again, growing industrial hemp, but the idea that we might send Henry Clay to prison for growing it 3 times is absurd. And the fact that we're still clinging to this mindset from, 20, 30 years ago, that was the appropriate response to handling someone who was growing a crop that was considered out of balance for the rest of the community. It's just, it's an interesting time to be part of, to be witnessing that transition. And as a Kentuckian, I would hope that transition process would happen faster than slower, but of course I'm mindful of also where I am. But it's interesting to have a governor who has stated on the record that he's in favor of moving this issue. So we'll see how that plays out. I mean, there's a lot for the new governor to handle, but I think as we move forward, we'll see that he might tackle this issue. How are we doing on time?
We have time for some questions if you want.
Well, that's what I'm hoping. So Q&A, folks.
Microphones are open for questions.
Patrick Welsh, Jim, thank you very much. My question is, were you always this strong an advocate for legalization when you began your research 10 years ago?
Thank you for your question. I don't really even feel like I'm an advocate. Like, you know.
Yes, you are.
Well, I'm really reporting what the experiences that I've had in this, in this process. I'm sharing with you, the people that I've encountered. I feel like once a person understands how the drug war has infected the criminal justice system and turned people against police and police against people, that it's very difficult to not take a side. And once one understands that, it's difficult to stand back and and not participate in moving that forward. It's property seizure laws alone. I'm sure you have a half decent car and a house. The law can just come and take your house and then make you prove that you've paid for that without charging you for a crime because of the nature of how we've granted power to law enforcement authorities to deal with this drug war. There's no due process left when it relates to prosecuting people for marijuana crimes. I was subpoenaed by the U.S. Marshal Service to testify at a federal grand jury. I didn't want to talk to the federal grand jury about what my possible knowledge of Johnny Boone. I had taken a photograph that's on the cover of the book. If I had not answered questions to the prosecutor, he would have done something which is called granting me a forced immunity, giving me immunity whether I liked it or not, which in effect eliminates any Fifth Amendment protections I might have had. Not that I would have claimed the Fifth Amendment as a protection because I neither witnessed nor participated in criminal activity. But once they grant a person forced immunity and they don't talk in a grand jury, then you go to the judge, and if you don't talk to the judge, that's contempt, and that's 18 months in prison. And that's just not right. It's just not right for a journalist to be subjected to the threat of 18 months in prison because I might know more than the U.S. Marshal Service about where their suspected drug fugitive is. And so, when you get threatened with 18 months of prison, it can turn you into an advocate, I guess. Yes, sir.
Hi, Jim, I'm John Cornbread, Press. I had a question, and now that we've cleared the building of all federal agents, do we know where Johnny Boone is?
I thought you knew.
Huh?
I thought you knew.
No. Anyway, I know you can't answer that question, and you probably don't email him or text him or anything like that either, but this is a fascinating book. It's one of my favorites. Undaunted Courage is the other one, which is Steve Ambrose. But this book I would highly recommend to everybody to read for lots of reasons. There's incredible Kentucky history throughout this book.
Thank you.
And one area that even the music industry, there are two famous clubs when I was growing up, which was the Club 68 and Club Cherry there. Mm-hmm. And the famous people that went through there, Lloyd Price, Stagger Lee, Johnny Cash, I think, played down there. Mm-hmm. But this little small place, could you tell us some stories about what went on around that? Because you and the people that did come play.
So I grew up, my Uncle Charlie, my great Uncle Charlie, Willett, was the outlaw in our family, and he, I would go with him to go fishing when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, and he would take me fishing, and then we would go back to the Blue Room, which is the back room to the Club 68, where we would clean the fish and fry them up in this little kitchen. And there was a poker game going on while we were there, and apparently that poker game started about 1965 and ended sometime in 1989. And they would send me off for cigarettes and pints, and I was this tall. So it was something that was always around in the culture. I'd heard these stories as a kid growing up. This person played, that person played. We'd hear, there'd be 45s on jukeboxes that they would play, and guys would play it would say, and when I started writing this book, I thought, well, none of this is going to check out, right? None of this is true. And then one thing after another, I started reading, the autobiography of Little Richard. And so the story is about Little Richard is that he comes to Lebanon in, say, 1951. And to put it in context very quickly, the reason why Lebanon was a stop on the Chitlin Circuit, where all these major black performers of national and international renown would play in a town like Lebanon, is because of segregation. Major theaters in major cities were off limits to those performers, or if they were able to perform there, they weren't able to perform to black audiences, and if they were, the black audiences were relegated to the balcony, right? So there were very few places where black performers could play to black audiences in the South, really anywhere, but especially in the South. So Lebanon had a railroad stop. It had liquor for sale, and it had a black population, and it had a couple of nightclubs. So this combination of things meant that they could get anybody to come off the train from Atlanta or down from Chicago and set them up for a couple of nights and make some money. And it also didn't hurt that some of these people running these nightclubs were Lebanese Americans, right, who were neither white nor black and sort of transcended the racial divide and could be white, white to the white folks and black to the black folks in this way that really sort of moved integration along in our community sort of further and faster by a generation than communities around us. So that was a very important catalyst to this whole thing. But sure, Ike and Tina Turner played in Lebanon a dozen times or 20 times, depending on who you ask. And Jimi Hendrix came through, and I was sure that didn't check out, but he was stationed in Fort Campbell and out of Nashville before he went to New York. So, this stuff checks out. Lebanon was a hopping spot, but once segregation ended and black performers could play in larger cities and clubs, there was no need for that any longer. So the level of talent at those clubs started to dwindle during the 70s, and in the 80s it was heavy metal rock bands, which is fine, but that's not exactly the caliber of talent that was there in the 60s and 70s for that reason. Yes, sir?
One of the things that struck me most interesting in your book was how the Kentucky marijuana fared in the Amsterdam markets and the horticultural engineering till we actually put together our own brand of Kentucky marijuana, which was the envy of markets all over the world, had its own identity. Can you speak to that?
That wasn't the sort of question I was anticipating answering from this crowd, but yes. I can speak on that. Apparently, Kentucky is a kind of perfect microclimate for the cannabis plant. If we can get this off and running, both industrial hemp, but also intoxicating marijuana, Kentucky is uniquely well suited. And why this is still kind of a scientific mystery. It could be the fact that Kentucky is on the same parallel as Afghanistan, and many of these strains of marijuana were originally bred in Afghanistan and the Hindu Kush mountains. But Kentucky is uniquely well suited for this kind of stuff. And you're right, seeds from Kentucky marijuana strains have made their way to places like Amsterdam and to places like California to be crossbred with strains from out there and become some of the major medical marijuana strains that people flock towards in places where it's legal. Like marijuana strains have all these crazy names, but there's a strain called Trainwreck, and Trainwreck is half Kentucky genetics, half California genetics. There's also a strain called Marijuana. I didn't make it up. But marijuana is the father plant of that strain is a Marion County plant that was taken from Marion County to California. So there's something uniquely well suited about Kentucky that makes it good for growing marijuana. And the fact that we're leaving that competitive advantage into the hands of criminals and law enforcement and not engaging it from a professional, tax-paying, regulated, business-minded sense remains frustrating to people like me. Yes, sir.
Charlie Mattingly with the Better Business Bureau. I'm married again, Mattingly, so I know most of the characters in your book. My main claim to fame is that I served as president of the St. Charles chapter of the Future Farmers of America 2 years after Bobby Joe Shoemaker, who was one of your main characters. So
That's a real claim to fame. That's important.
That's right. Bobby Joe may well deserve to be in jail. I was curious about his status. You know what he is?
Bobby Joe Shoemaker is serving the back end of a 35-year prison sentence. 25 for the marijuana, 5 for the fugitive stuff, or 10 for the fugitive stuff. He was a fugitive from 85 to 89. They caught him in Canada. So being an international fugitive does tack on the years. But he's due to get out this year or next year. He's currently housed in Lexington at the FCI hospital prison in Lexington, the medical facility. I'm not sure exactly what his status is, but I've met members of his family. He'll be out this year or next. So we'll see how I fare when that happens. Yes, sir.
I've got two.
Okay.
One is a medical question.
Yes, sir.
Many
I'm
of us,
not a doctor.
no, you don't have to do this,
Okay.
but you may have an answer for it. Many are aware of the allegations that were proven to be true about the tobacco industry and the consequences health-wise.
Okay.
Are there any studies that are reasonable as the consequences of using medical marijuana as an inhalant? Even though it may not have some of the chemicals that cigarettes do, they do, I understand, the agricultural people who do create that, protect their harvest, do use chemicals as well, which may be deadly and harming to the human being as well.
Okay.
And secondly, law enforcement, so we've got medical. Secondly, law enforcement people, with which I'm familiar, have said that rather than to call these people as entrepreneurs of business, they are much more like the Al Capones in that he was an entrepreneur who chose criminal behavior, often very violent behavior, simply as a way to make fast dollars. And that there's also that element has been in the criminal part of marijuana. Would that really go away if it's all commercialized? Thank you.
Thank you. So 2 questions. They're both very good. The first one relates to impurities in the product. Can it be, pesticides, for instance, be damaging, harmful to the health of smokers? And the answer is definitely yes. And when you're growing or using black market marijuana, you have no idea what's being put into that sort of stuff. What is advantageous about the legal market in places like California and Colorado is all those places, to be legal and certified and licensed, all of those dispensaries have to test all of their product for residual pesticides, residual chemicals that they put in during the process, and those testing processes are very tight. The one problem that's very mindful in legal marijuana producers these days, especially as a lot of legal marijuana is going towards, not to get too inside baseball, but into concentrates, into waxes and essentially hash, right? They're distilling down the flour product, the organic product, into concentrates. So if there's impurities like pesticides in the actual product, when you concentrate that down, you're concentrating the pesticide as well, which makes it doubly, triply harmful. So it's something that growers in legal markets are very mindful of, and they're testing to ensure that contaminants like pesticides are not included in their legal product. Now, in terms of comparing marijuana entrepreneurs to people like Al Capone, I think it's an apt comparison, because Al Capone was engaged in criminal activity, selling a product that was criminalized for arbitrary reasons, and then that prohibition was repealed. And that criminal activity associated with that product went away immediately when that prohibition was repealed. So I think that it's an apt comparison that law enforcement make. Criminals do flock to criminal activity, and criminals, when they don't have legal means to address differences of opinion or business misunderstandings, there's nothing to resort. They can't take them to small claims court, or they can't take them to civil court. So violence is a result of not the drug, but the prohibition of the drug, right? It's not the alcohol, it was the prohibition of the alcohol that made people like Al Capone violent. So I would also be mindful of people in law enforcement who tell you that marijuana is bad and we should maintain the prohibition of it, but also be mindful that folks in the law enforcement industry rely on federal grants to get them overtime, to get their high salaries for the year so that it counts towards their pensions. So if we're talking about fast money, we also should talk about fast pensions in the law enforcement community as a motivator to maintain the status quo. Yes, ma'am?
The drug war, of course, was not just about marijuana. It is not just about marijuana.
Yes, sir.
And there are many arguments about injustices going on with other substances, such as the distinction between powder cocaine and crack cocaine.
Very good.
I'd like to hear your recommendation as to what substances, or how do you decide on a process to identify substances that should be regulated and taxed, and should substances that, for public safety and health in general, ought to be prohibited?
It's a very good question, a very difficult question, especially as we sort of move beyond this understanding that, I mean, this is sort of graduate level drug policy reform, like, beyond the marijuana prohibition. Heroin overdoses are killing hundreds of people in this state and across the country at a rapid rate, and it's something that we really need to get a handle on. The question is, how is the best way to do that? Is tougher sentences for the people who deal heroin the answer, or is providing people who are addicted to heroin safer access to treatment and to use until they decide to go to treatment? So now that Kentucky has implemented needle exchange programs, the resistance to needle exchange as a harm reduction strategy is, well, you're just consenting to them using drugs. You're just letting drug users be drug users. But one, we're reducing, by providing a needle exchange, we're taking dirty needles out of circulation and preventing the spread of diseases like HIV and hepatitis. But also we're giving those addicts, when they come in to exchange dirty needles for clean needles, an opportunity to seek treatment during that exchange process. When they get a clean needle is the opportunity for a healthcare professional to invite them into treatment, to get them off of the drug that they're on. So these are the means, the outside of law enforcement means by which we can start addressing people who are using harmful substances that could be detrimental to their life and to their families, without throwing them into the clink, right? Without employing just the justice system as a one-size-fits-all approach to how we go about this stuff. The powder and crack cocaine disparity that you mentioned is certainly an issue at the federal level. That disparity. So for folks who aren't familiar, powder cocaine gets you. Well, the trigger for a mandatory minimum was at one point 100 to 1. So it was, I don't know, like something like took 100 grams of powder cocaine to trigger the minimum, or 1 gram of crack cocaine to trigger the minimum, which caught up a lot of people who are in the crack cocaine market, which happens to be minorities in poor neighborhoods, where powder cocaine tends to be used by more affluent people in more affluent neighborhoods. So the penalty for the affluent powder cocaine user was much less than, 100 times less than, the crack cocaine user. Now that's been reduced to 18 to 1, but it's really something that ought to be eliminated entirely. There's no difference chemically between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. The fact that we sentence people at different rates depending on how that drug is confiscated is cultural. We're doing that because of the crack cocaine scare from the 80s and 90s, and not based on any sort of scientific approach.
Last question there.
This is a
Quick question.
So I'm prefacing this question with a comment. I read a book many years ago about a memoir of one of the Bullitt members, family members, who grew up on Oxmoor in the 1850s. And one of the sections dealt with the huge hemp crop that they had at that time.
Okay.
That was one of their big cash crops. And it was very labor intensive and so forth. Obviously, the worldwide market then for hemp was probably rope or things like that. Has that changed, and what is the worldwide market for hemp now? What is it primarily used for, and what sort of benefit would it be in comparison to the marijuana that you might be getting to grow hemp?
Well, so to answer these questions in reverse, you can't grow marijuana where you're growing hemp. Just like as a horticultural reality, hemp is the males and the female plants together. The males fertilize the female plants. Marijuana, when you're talking about intoxicating marijuana to smoke, That's the unfertilized female flower. So growers of marijuana are very, very cautious to make sure there's no male plants anywhere near their female plants, because the female plant, cannabis is dioecious, which means the male plants and the female plants are on different flowers. And there's not many plants like that, but like ginkgo trees and willows, you know, like you have a ginkgo tree, you're like, oh, this is really nice, but then it's the wrong kind and it makes those berries and you have to step on them. It's like that, but for marijuana. So you have female marijuana plants, and those growers want them unfertilized till the end. Those female plants secrete a resin to make them sticky to attract pollen, and it's that resin that's psychoactive, right? So in a hemp field where you have the males and the females together, the male plants make a lot of pollen, so they instantly pollinate the female plants that are next to them in the field, and then those females immediately stop making the resin that's psychoactive and start making seeds that are not psychoactive. So this idea that, not that this is what you suggested, but just to make sure, the idea that you can plant marijuana, illicit marijuana inside of a hemp field and have marijuana and hemp at the same time is scientifically not possible, because the hemp pollinates the marijuana and then it's put. So that's that part. What are the
The size of the market, what is the size of the worldwide market for hemp nowadays? You know, in the 1850s, it was probably used for rope.
It was rope, and in the 30s, in the 1930s, the push to have hemp outlawed was made by Dow Chemical, who had just introduced nylon, and nylon was the primary competitor to hemp twine, right? So there's a lot of food products that are using hemp seeds now. There's a lot of healthcare products, lotions and bath soaps and that sort of thing. They're using hemp seed oil. But the real interesting and sort of scalable at a large scale product is using them in automotive for lots of different things, like automotive upholstery, for seats and whatnot, but then also the plastics, turning the fibers in the herd into hemp-based plastics for body panels, for dashboards, and as places like Ford are looking to lighten, they're just added 2,000 jobs on the Super Duty plant, and the whole idea of the Super Duty is to lighten the frame of it. Then hemp-based plastic might play a role in Ford's strategy to take its truck line and make the body lighter. I think once we work out the problems with getting the hemp plant out of the ground and to market, we're missing the first generation and second generation processes to really make it viable on a large scale, because we don't have these machines or factories any longer. Like you said, very work intensive, labor intensive then, and some of the technology we're using now, like what China's processing hemp by hand, just like they were doing in America 200 years ago, and they're against automation in China because they're using the manpower. They don't want to lose the manpower. Places like Australia have mechanisms to do some of this work, but they're reverse engineering these machines. When Kentuckians are trying to buy things from other countries, they're coming in broken because those other countries don't want Kentucky to compete with them. So there is a global market, and the global market is concerned that Kentucky is going to hedge into their business. And it's up to Kentucky to find that way. No one's going to help Kentucky but ourselves.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.